Picture this, a sprawling limestone palace perched on 18 manicured acres in Beverly Hills, its 55 rooms draped in shadows and silence on a cold February night in 1929, when 2 gunshots shattered the illusion of invincibility that oil money had built, leaving behind a crimson stain on a guest bedroom floor that no amount of wealth, power, or carefully constructed narrative could ever wash away. This is Greystone Manor, and if these walls could speak, they would whisper not of champagne wishes and caviar dreams, but of a darkness so profound, so deliberately obscured by the machinery of American aristocracy, that nearly a century later we still don't know whether what happened that night was murder, suicide, or something far more sinister, a truth so dangerous that it had to be buried beneath 46,000 square feet of Indiana limestone, English oak paneling, and the kind of silence that only immense wealth can purchase. What really happened in that guest bedroom when Ned Doheny Jr., the golden heir to one of America's greatest oil fortunes, was found dead alongside his secretary and rumored lover, Hugh Plunkett, in what authorities rushed to call a murder-suicide before the blood had even dried? What secrets were so valuable that they required the full weight of the Los Angeles Police Department, the district attorney's office, the Doheny family's political connections, and the complicit silence of an entire social class to keep them hidden? And what does this $82 million monument to Gilded age excess, now a city park where tourists picnic on lawns that once ran red with scandal, reveal about the true cost of the American dream, the lies we tell ourselves about meritocracy and self-made men, and the bodies that pile up, quite literally, when wealth becomes concentrated enough to rewrite reality itself? To understand what happened that February night, we must first understand the men who built this palace of secrets, Edward Doheny Sr., because Greystone wasn't just a house, it was a fortress designed to protect a legacy built on blood, bribery, and the systematic exploitation of land and people, a monument to the fundamental American delusion that enough money can erase any sin, silence any witness, and rewrite any history, and the fact that it failed so spectacularly that scandal seeped through its walls anyway, makes it perhaps the most honest structure ever erected by American oil money. Edward Doheny's story begins not in the marble halls of power but in the dusty mining camps of the American West in 1856, born in Wisconsin to Irish immigrant parents who had fled the Great Famine's mass graves only to find a different kind of starvation in America's promised land, and young Edward learned early that survival required ruthlessness, that fortune favored not the moral but the persistent, the willing to dig deeper, drill harder, and ask fewer questions than the next man. He spent his 20s and 30s as a prospector, drifting through New Mexico, Arizona, and California, perpetually broke, perpetually chasing the next strike, surviving on beans and bravado, twice married, the first wife dead from illness, the second, Carrie Estelle Betzold, tough enough to endure the boom and bust cycles that defined frontier capitalism, and it wasn't until 1892, when Doheny was already 36 years old and facing the bitter prospect of dying poor, that he made the strike that would transform him from dusty prospector into oil baron. The location was Los Angeles, specifically a vacant lot near present-day Dodger Stadium, where Doheny noticed tar bubbling up from the ground and, lacking any formal geological training but possessed of the gambler's instinct that separates tycoons from ordinary men, convinced his partner Charles Canfield to help him dig, and at just 165 feet down, shallow by modern standards but backbreaking labor with 1890s equipment, they struck oil, the first discovery in the Los Angeles basin that would soon become one of the world's most productive petroleum fields, transforming Southern California from sleepy orange groves into an industrial powerhouse and making Doheny, through a combination of ruthless business acumen, strategic partnerships, and the kind of moral flexibility that Carnegie and Rockefeller would have recognized, into one of America's wealthiest men, worth an estimated $100 million by the 1920s, the equivalent of roughly $15 billion in today's currency. But here's what the official histories, the kind displayed on plaques at Greystone for tourists who wander through marveling at the ballroom's crystal chandeliers, conveniently omit. Doheny's fortune wasn't built through innovation or hard work alone, but through the systematic exploitation of Mexican land and labor during that country's most vulnerable period, through cozy relationships with the murderous dictator Porfirio Diaz, through the financing of counter-revolutionary forces during Mexico's Civil War, through bribes to American politicians that would eventually explode into the Teapot Dome scandal, the worst corruption case in American history before Watergate, and through the use of private armed forces that murdered striking workers, intimidated journalists, and enforced a corporate feudalism in the oil fields that differed from slavery primarily in that the bodies were easier to dispose of and replace. Doheny's Mexican Petroleum Company, founded in 1900, didn't just extract oil from Mexican soil, it extracted Mexican sovereignty itself, operating as a state within a state, maintaining its own army, building its own infrastructure, and answering to no authority but profit, and when the Mexican Revolution threatened these arrangements, Doheny didn't hesitate to funnel money and weapons to whatever faction seemed most likely to protect his interests, playing all sides with the amoral calculation of a man who understood that in the game of empire, loyalty is just another commodity to be bought and sold. The human cost of this empire was staggering. Workers in Doheny's Mexican fields labored in conditions that shocked even the era's weak labor inspectors, living in company-owned shacks, paid in company scrip only redeemable at company stores where prices were inflated to ensure permanent debt, working 12 to 16-hour shifts in temperatures that regularly killed men from heat exhaustion, and if they complained, if they organized, if they so much as whispered the word union, they simply disappeared, buried in unmarked graves in the Tampico jungle or dumped in the Panuco River to be eaten by crocodiles, because Doheny understood what all successful robber barons understood, that the machinery of capitalism runs on blood, and the only question is whose blood you're willing to spill and how effectively you can hide the stains. By the 1920s, with his fortune secure and his position in American society seemingly unassailable, Doheny began planning his legacy, and like all men of his generation and class who had climbed from poverty to plutocracy, he understood that wealth without respectability was incomplete, that money alone couldn't erase the stink of the mining camp, the taint of frontier roughness, and so he set about buying not just mansions and art and politicians, but history itself, commissioning a biography that erased the bribery and violence and presented him as a self-made hero, donating to universities and churches with the expectation that buildings would bear his name, and most ambitiously, building for his only surviving son, Edward Ned Doheny Jr., a palace so magnificent, so undeniably refined, that it would cement the family's position in American aristocracy and erase, once and for all, the memory of Edward Sr.'s rough beginnings. Ned Doheny Jr. was everything his father had dreamed of creating. Born in 1893, after Edward Sr.'s fortune was already established, Ned never knew poverty, never dug in the dirt, never made the moral compromises that built the empire he would inherit, and Edward Sr. was determined to keep it that way, giving young Ned the finest education money could buy, sending him to the University of Southern California and then Stanford, grooming him not for the oil fields but for the boardroom and the country club, for a life of refined management of the machinery his father had built on Mexican corpses. Ned was handsome in the clean-cut way of 1920s leading men, athletic, charming, a competent student if not a brilliant one, and in 1914 he married Lucy Marceline Smith, heiress to her own fortune, in a society wedding that marked the Dohenys' full arrival into California's elite, and together they began producing the grandchildren that Edward Sr. hoped would finally, irrevocably, separate the family name from its blood-soaked origins. To house this dynasty, to create a physical manifestation of the Doheny family's permanent ascension, Edward Sr. purchased 18 acres in Beverly Hills in 1925 and commissioned the architectural firm of Gordon Kaufman to design a mansion that would surpass anything yet built on the West Coast, and what emerged over the next 3 years was Greystone Manor, a 46,054-square-foot Gothic Tudor Revival palace built at a cost of $3 million in 1920s money, roughly $46 million today. Though this figure wildly understates the true expense because it doesn't account for the custom craftsmanship, the imported materials, the armies of laborers whose wages were off the books, or the political bribes required to secure water rights and building permits in a city where everything, always, was for sale. The mansion statistics alone stagger the imagination: 55 rooms including 16 bedrooms, multiple libraries, a bowling alley, a billiards room, a screening room equipped with state-of-the-art projection equipment, servants' quarters designed to house 12 live-in staff, formal gardens designed by the same landscape architect who shaped much of Beverly Hills, and a garage that could accommodate 15 vehicles, because in the 1920s, before the crash, before reality reasserted itself, there seemed no limit to how much space wealth could claim, how many rooms a family of 4 could possibly need, and the fact that most of these rooms would remain empty most of the time was precisely the point. They were a demonstration of excess, a middle finger to anyone who remembered Edward Sr. eating beans in a mining camp, a statement that the Dohenys had arrived and would never, ever, have to leave. But here's what makes Greystone different from the other monuments to jazz-age excess that dotted the Hollywood Hills in those years before the crash. This one was built with a specific, urgent purpose, to protect Ned from the scandal that was about to engulf the family, because by the time construction began in 1925, the Teapot Dome investigation was accelerating, and Edward Sr. knew, even if the public didn't yet, that his bribes to Interior Secretary Albert Fall were about to become front page news, that his reputation was about to be shredded, and that the only way to protect his son's future was to so thoroughly embed the family in California's social architecture, to make them so undeniably established, that even scandal couldn't dislodge them. The Teapot Dome scandal, for those who learned about it as a footnote in high school history class, was the Watergate of its era, a corruption case so brazen, so obviously criminal, that it temporarily shocked even the cynical American public, and Edward Doheny Sr. was at its dark heart. The basic facts were these. In 1921, Interior Secretary Albert Fall, a man whose career had been financed by oil money and whose loyalty was available to the highest bidder, convinced President Warren Harding to transfer control of federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, from the Navy to the Interior Department, and then, without competitive bidding, leased these reserves to private companies, specifically Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil and Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum, in exchange for cash bribes that Fall attempted to disguise as loans. But here's what makes this more than just another corruption story. These weren't just valuable oil reserves, they were strategic military reserves, set aside specifically to ensure the Navy would have fuel in the event of war, and Fall, bribed by Doheny and Sinclair, essentially sold American national security to private corporations, and when the scheme was exposed in 1922, when Senate investigators began pulling on the thread, the entire rotten tapestry of 1920s oil politics began to unravel. Doheny's specific crime was lending Fall $100,000 in cash, the equivalent of roughly $1.5 million today, delivered to Fall's New Mexico ranch in a little black bag by Ned Doheny Jr. himself, accompanied by Ned's personal secretary, Hugh Plunkett, and this detail, the image of the oil heir and his handsome young secretary delivering a black bag full of cash to a corrupt cabinet secretary, became central to the scandal's mythology, and more importantly, placed Ned Doheny directly in the criminal crosshairs, because he wasn't just the son of the briber, he was an active participant, a courier, and potentially a witness who could bring down not just his father but the entire rotten edifice of oil government collusion. The investigation dragged on for years, dominating newspapers, destroying reputations, and culminating in a series of trials in 1926 and 1927, and here the true power of Doheny's wealth became apparent. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite the confession of the crime itself, Doheny never denied lending the money, only its corrupt purpose. Despite the fact that Fall was convicted of accepting the bribe, Edward Doheny Sr. was acquitted of giving it, a legal impossibility that could only be explained by the quality of lawyers that oil money could purchase, the witnesses that oil money could silence, the jurors that oil money could influence, and the fundamental American legal principle that sufficient wealth places one above the law, not because the law doesn't apply but because the law, in practice, is a commodity like any other. But the acquittal, while it kept Edward Sr. out of prison, couldn't erase the reputational damage, couldn't undo the fact that the Doheny name was now, in the public imagination, synonymous with corruption, that every newspaper in America had run stories about Doheny's bribery, his manipulation of Mexican politics, his exploitation of workers, and for a man who had spent millions trying to buy respectability, this was a catastrophic failure, and more importantly, it placed enormous pressure on Ned Doheny Jr., who now carried not just the weight of inheriting an oil empire but the burden of redeeming his father's reputation, of proving that the next generation of Dohenys could be different, cleaner, more respectable. It was into this context of legal vindication but social condemnation that the Doheny family moved into Greystone Manor on September 15, 1928, less than 5 months before the murder that would ensure the mansion's infamy, and the timing is crucial because it means the house was never what it was supposed to be, never a symbol of triumphant arrival but always, from day one, a fortress under siege, a monument to a reputation that was already in tatters, and everyone living within its walls knew it, could feel the weight of expectation, the desperation to perform normalcy and respectability even as the machinery of their empire ground up lives thousands of miles away in the Tampico oil fields. The household at Greystone in those brief months before the shooting consisted of Ned Doheny Jr., his wife Lucy, and their 5 children, ranging in age from 13-year-old Dickie down to 3-year-old twins, and this detail matters because it reminds us that this wasn't just an abstract palace of wealth, it was a family home, with children's laughter echoing through the halls, with homework and bedtimes and birthday parties, with all the ordinary rituals of domestic life happening simultaneously with the extraordinary weight of dynasty and scandal. Also living in the mansion, in a suite of rooms that was officially described as secretary's quarters but functioned more like a second master suite, was Hugh Plunkett, Ned's personal secretary, his closest companion, the man who had accompanied him to deliver that infamous black bag of cash to Albert Fall, and the man who would die alongside him 5 months after Greystone's inauguration. Who was Hugh Plunkett? This is where the official histories become deliberately vague, where the family's carefully constructed narrative starts to crumble, because Plunkett was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in Ned Doheny's life. He appears in photographs, always at Ned's side, impeccably dressed, handsome in a darker, more intense way than Ned's all-American looks. He traveled with the family, managed Ned's correspondence, handled sensitive legal matters, and enjoyed a level of intimacy and access that went far beyond what a secretary's role typically entailed, even for the wealthy, and yet his background remains curiously obscure, his family rarely mentioned, his life before entering Doheny employ a blank space that suggests either a deliberate erasure or a man who had something to hide. What we do know is that Plunkett was a doctor, trained as a physician, which makes his role as a secretary immediately suspicious. Why would a man with medical training work in what was essentially an administrative position for another man his own age? The most generous interpretation is that Plunkett's medical knowledge was valuable in managing Ned's health issues, because Ned, despite his outward vitality, suffered from chronic pain and illness, possibly related to a previous injury or congenital condition, and required regular medical attention. But this explanation, while plausible, doesn't account for the intensity of the relationship, the fact that Plunkett essentially lived with the family, the whispers among the household staff about the two men's closeness, whispers that were carefully excluded from official accounts but that persist in oral histories and contemporary gossip. The alternative interpretation, the one that the Doheny family's lawyers worked desperately to suppress, that contemporary newspapers could only hint at through coded language about bachelor friendships and intimate companions, and that modern historians can state more plainly, is that Ned and Hugh were lovers, that their relationship was romantic and physical, and that this was the real secret that Greystone's walls were built to protect, not just wealth and power, but forbidden desire, the kind of love that in 1929 was not just socially unacceptable but criminal, that could destroy a family's reputation more thoroughly than even bribery charges, and that therefore had to be hidden behind the respectable facade of employer-employee, behind the wife and children, behind the elaborate performance of heterosexual domesticity that the mansion both enabled and demanded. The evidence for this interpretation is necessarily circumstantial because direct evidence was systematically destroyed in the scandal's aftermath, but it's overwhelming in its cumulative weight. There are the living arrangements, with Plunkett residing in the family home despite having no family of his own and no obvious reason to be there constantly. There are the financial arrangements, with Ned providing for Plunkett far beyond what any secretary's salary would warrant, including life insurance policies and trust funds. There are the travel records, showing that the two men frequently traveled alone together, without Lucy, on trips that had no clear business purpose. There are the letters, most of which were destroyed, but fragments of which survived and contain language of intense emotional attachment that goes beyond friendship. And there are the oral histories from household staff, collected decades later when the principals were dead and social attitudes had shifted, describing a relationship that everyone in the house understood but no one could speak about, a secret that was simultaneously open and utterly forbidden. If this interpretation is correct, and the balance of evidence suggests it is, then every aspect of the Greystone story becomes darker and more complex, because it means that Ned Doheny was living in a cage built by his own family's wealth, trapped between the men he loved and the life he was required to perform, unable to escape because any public acknowledgement of his sexuality would destroy not just himself but his wife, his children, his father's already damaged reputation, and the carefully constructed social position that represented 3 generations of climbing from poverty. And the only question is whether that cage, that unbearable tension between public performance and private truth, drove one of the two men to violence, or whether someone else, someone with a vested interest in silencing them both, pulled the trigger. The answer matters less than you might think, because either way, this is a story about how wealth and social expectation kill, how the mansion itself, this beautiful, suffocating monument to respectability, became a murder weapon, and how the truth about what happened that February night was immediately and systematically obscured by every institution that should have revealed it. Here's what we know for certain about February 16, 1929. At approximately 11 p.m., 2 gunshots rang out in a guest bedroom in Greystone's north wing, and when servants rushed to investigate, they found Ned Doheny Jr., age 35, lying on the floor dead from a gunshot wound to the head, and Hugh Plunkett, age 36, also dead from a gunshot to the head, with a .45 caliber Bisley revolver lying near Plunkett's body. Lucy Doheny was in the house, as were the children, as were approximately half a dozen servants, but no one claimed to have witnessed the actual shooting, and here the official account begins its immediate divergence from credibility. The Los Angeles Police Department arrived within the hour, remarkably fast, suspiciously fast, the kind of response time that suggested someone with serious connections had made a phone call, and before conducting any serious investigation, before interviewing witnesses systematically, before processing the crime scene with anything resembling forensic rigor, the lead detective, a man named Joe Taylor who had received numerous gifts from the Doheny family over the years, announced to the press that this was clearly a murder-suicide, that Hugh Plunkett had killed Ned Doheny and then himself. Case closed, tragedy for a prominent family, nothing more to see here. The speed of this determination is the first major red flag, because actual murder investigations, especially involving prominent families, take time. Detectives gather evidence, interview witnesses multiple times, consider alternative theories, build a case that can withstand prosecutorial scrutiny, but in this case, the conclusion preceded the investigation. The narrative was fixed before the bodies were cold, and every subsequent action by authorities had the character not of seeking truth but of confirming a predetermined story. The second red flag is the physical evidence, which even by 1929 forensic standards, didn't support the murder-suicide theory. The gunshot wounds were unusual. Both men were shot on the right side of the head, but Plunkett was right-handed and Ned was left-handed, and the angle of entry suggested that if Plunkett had shot Ned and then himself, he would have had to contort his arm in an anatomically awkward position, possible but unlikely, and certainly not the natural positioning you'd expect from a suicide. Moreover, there were powder burns on Ned's head consistent with a contact wound, but Plunkett's wound showed powder burns at a distance of several inches, suggesting that if this was a suicide, Plunkett held the gun away from his head when he fired, which is counterintuitive. People who shoot themselves in the head typically press the gun directly against their skull to ensure death, not hold it at arm's length. The third red flag is the gun itself, a .45 caliber Bisley revolver, a heavy, powerful weapon designed for target shooting and hunting, not the kind of gun typically used in crimes of passion, and certainly not a weapon you'd expect Plunkett to have on hand unless he had planned this in advance. But there was no evidence of planning, no suicide note, no indication that either man expected violence that evening, and in fact, witnesses placed both men in apparently good spirits just hours before the shooting. The fourth red flag is the location. The shooting occurred in a guest bedroom, not in Plunkett's suite or Ned's private quarters, raising the question of why they were in that particular room at that particular time, and the official explanation, that they had retired there to discuss business, is absurd on its face because who discusses business at 11 p.m. in a guest bedroom when both men had private offices and it was the weekend? The fifth and most damning red flag is what happened immediately after the police made their murder-suicide determination. The crime scene was released back to the family within hours, furniture was removed, bloodstains were cleaned, the room was repainted, and potential evidence was destroyed before any independent investigation could take place, and when the district attorney's office announced it would conduct an inquest, it did so in a manner clearly designed to ratify the police conclusion. Rather than investigate alternatives, calling only witnesses who supported the murder-suicide theory, cutting off questions that led in uncomfortable directions, and rushing to a conclusion within days. The inquest, held in late February 1929, was a farce even by the standards of 1920s Los Angeles justice, which was saying something because this was the era of systematic police corruption, when the LAPD was essentially a private security force for the studios and oil companies, when district attorneys built their careers by protecting the powerful and prosecuting the poor, and when the very concept of equal justice was a cruel joke that everyone understood but pretended to believe. The key witness was Lucy Doheny herself, and her testimony is crucial both for what it said and what it carefully avoided saying. She claimed that on the evening of February 16, she had been in her room, that Ned and Hugh were in the guest bedroom discussing business, that she heard 2 shots in rapid succession, that she rushed to the room and found both men dead, and that she saw the gun near Hugh's body. But here's what makes this testimony immediately suspicious: if there were 2 shots in rapid succession, how did the second shooter, whether it was Plunkett shooting himself after killing Ned, or Ned shooting Plunkett after being shot, or a third party shooting both, have time to fire before someone intervened? Where were the servants, who should have been closer and responded faster? Why was Lucy apparently alone in that part of the mansion at 11 p.m. when standard household practice would have had servants nearby? And most importantly, why did Lucy's description of events remain remarkably consistent across multiple retellings, with the kind of verbal precision that suggests a rehearsed script rather than traumatic memory? Other witnesses, specifically the servants who testified, told stories that were suspiciously vague. They heard shots, they rushed upstairs, they found the bodies, they saw Mrs. Doheny in distress, but none of them could provide specific details about timing, about who was where when, about what exactly they saw when they entered the room. And several admitted under questioning that they had been instructed by family attorneys about what to say and what not to say, and this fact alone, that witnesses were being coached by lawyers before testifying, should have prompted the district attorney to halt proceedings and launch a real investigation, but it didn't, because everyone involved understood that the point of this inquest was not to find truth but to create a legal record that would protect the Doheny family from further scandal. The medical examiner's report added more questions than it answered. The autopsy findings, what little was released publicly, confirmed that both men died from gunshot wounds to the head and that death was likely instantaneous for both, but the report was curiously incomplete, lacking details about powder burns, trajectory analysis, and time of death estimates that should have been standard even in 1929. And when later investigators tried to obtain the full report, they found that key pages were missing, either lost to bureaucratic incompetence or, more likely, deliberately removed. The inquest concluded after just 2 days with a verdict that surprised no one. Hugh Plunkett had murdered Ned Doheny in a fit of temporary insanity and then killed himself, and the reason for this sudden violent insanity was left deliberately vague, attributed to mental aberration and personal troubles. Coded language that everyone understood meant either jealousy over an unnamed romantic entanglement or, in the whispered version that circulated but could never be printed, the possibility that Plunkett and Ned's relationship had reached some kind of crisis point, that one wanted to end it or expose it, and that violence resulted. But here's what the official verdict couldn't explain: if this was a crime of passion, if Plunkett had snapped in a moment of rage or despair, why was there no evidence of a struggle, no furniture disturbed, no defensive wounds on either body, no signs that Ned had tried to fight back or escape? If this was murder-suicide, why did Plunkett, who allegedly loved Ned, choose to kill him in a way that would inevitably expose their relationship through the investigation, rather than choosing a method that would preserve both men's reputations? And if the shooting happened as the official story claimed, with Plunkett shooting Ned and then immediately shooting himself, why did multiple neighbors report seeing cars leaving Greystone at high speed shortly after the shots were fired, suggesting that someone else was present and fled the scene? These questions were not pursued, not by the police, not by the district attorney, not by the press, which dutifully reported the murder-suicide verdict and then, with suspicious speed, moved on to other stories, and the reason for this systematic incuriosity is obvious. Pursuing these questions would have required investigating the Doheny family itself, would have required asking what Edward Doheny Sr. knew and when he knew it, would have required examining the possibility that someone with access to the house and a motive to silence both men had committed a double murder and staged it as a murder-suicide. And in 1929 Los Angeles, where oil money controlled the police, the press, and the political establishment, such an investigation was not just unlikely but impossible. The alternative theories, which were discussed privately but never seriously investigated publicly, fall into 3 broad categories, each more disturbing than the official murder-suicide verdict. The first theory is that Ned Doheny killed Hugh Plunkett and then himself, which inverts the official story but suffers from many of the same evidentiary problems. Why would Ned, who had everything to live for in conventional terms, wealth, family, social position, choose to kill both himself and his companion, and why would he do it in a way that would inevitably expose their relationship and traumatize his family? This theory only makes sense if we assume that Ned was in such profound psychological distress, trapped so completely between his public obligations and private desires, that death seemed like the only escape. But if this were the case, we'd expect to see evidence of that distress in the days and weeks before the shooting, and we don't. By all accounts, Ned seemed in good spirits, was making plans for the future, and showed no signs of suicidal ideation. The second theory, which has gained more traction among modern investigators, is that this was a murder-suicide but with a different motive than the official story suggested, specifically, that the relationship between Ned and Hugh had become a blackmail situation, that someone, either within the family or connected to the family's business interests, had discovered the nature of their relationship and threatened to expose it, and that one or both men decided that death was preferable to the scandal and criminal prosecution that exposure would bring in 1929 California, where homosexuality was a felony that could result in prison time and forced institutionalization. This theory has the advantage of explaining the rushed police investigation and the family's eagerness to close the case. If Ned and Hugh's relationship was the real scandal, then any investigation that dug too deep would expose it, and the family would have been desperate to prevent that, even if it meant accepting a murder-suicide verdict that reflected badly on them. Because murder-suicide could be blamed on mental illness and temporary insanity, but homosexuality would have been seen as a permanent moral stain that destroyed the family's reputation and endangered the children's futures. The third theory, which is the most disturbing and has the most evidentiary support despite being the least investigated, is that this was a double murder, that someone else shot both men and staged the scene to look like a murder-suicide, and that the police investigation was deliberately sabotaged to protect the real killer. Who would have had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit such a murder? The suspect list is shorter than you might think. It would have to be someone with access to Greystone, someone the two men would have admitted to a private room at 11 p.m., someone who knew how to use a gun, someone who had a motive to silence both men permanently, and someone with enough power or connections to ensure that the subsequent investigation would be controlled and contained. And when you apply these criteria, The list of potential suspects narrows dramatically, centering on people within the family's inner circle or their business associates, people who might have seen Ned and Hugh's relationship not just as a personal scandal but as a threat to the oil empire's stability and the family's business interests. One name that appears repeatedly in the conspiracy theories, though never with definitive proof, is Edward Doheny Sr. himself, and the logic is chilling but coherent. Edward Sr. had spent millions building his reputation and establishing his dynasty. The Teapot Dome scandal had already damaged him badly, and the potential exposure of his son's homosexuality would have been catastrophic, not just socially but legally, because Ned was a key witness in ongoing lawsuits related to Teapot Dome, and any scandal that undermined his credibility could have reopened criminal investigations and destroyed the legal victories that Edward Sr.'s lawyers had secured. Moreover, Edward Sr. was known to be a ruthless man, had ordered violence against striking workers in Mexico, had no moral compunctions about using force to protect his interests, and had the resources to hire professional killers and corrupt police investigations. So if he concluded that his son and Plunkett had become liabilities that threatened everything he'd built, would he have hesitated to eliminate them? The evidence for this theory is purely circumstantial but includes some disturbing details. Edward Sr. was not at Greystone the night of the shooting, claiming to be at his downtown Los Angeles mansion, but had no witnesses to confirm his alibi for the crucial hours. In the weeks before the shooting, Edward Sr. had increased Ned's life insurance policy substantially, which could suggest either paternal concern or premeditation, and most tellingly, Edward Sr.'s reaction to his son's death was strangely controlled, showing grief certainly, but not the overwhelming devastation you'd expect from a father who had just lost his only son, and within months he was back to business as usual, managing his oil empire with the same ruthless efficiency, as if Ned's death had been not a tragedy but a problem that had been solved. The alternative suspect, equally plausible and equally disturbing, is Lucy Doheny herself, and this theory begins with a simple question: what did Lucy know, and when did she know it? If Ned and Hugh were lovers, Lucy must have known. She lived in the same house, saw them together constantly, observed an intimacy that went beyond employer-employee, and dealt with the gossip from servants and society friends. So the question is not whether she knew but how she felt about it and what she was prepared to do. The traditional assumption is that Lucy, as a woman of her era and class, would have accepted this arrangement as the price of maintaining her social position and providing for her children, that she would have participated in the elaborate performance of heterosexual domesticity while privately acknowledging the truth, but this assumption may be giving Lucy too little credit for agency and too much credit for passivity, because there's another possibility, that Lucy was not a passive victim of circumstance but an active participant in managing her husband's public image, and that when the relationship between Ned and Hugh threatened to become public, threatening not just Ned's reputation but her own position and her children's inheritance, she took action. The evidence for Lucy as murderer is thin but intriguing. She was in the house, she had access to the room, she knew both men's habits and routines, she had a motive to silence them both if their relationship threatened her family's position, and most significantly, her testimony at the inquest had the character of a prepared script, with the kind of detailed consistency that suggests either traumatic fixation or deliberate rehearsal. Moreover, Lucy's behavior in the years after the shooting was curious. She remained at Greystone for a time, then moved out, never remarrying, living as a wealthy widow for another 5 decades, always maintaining the official story, never deviating from the murder-suicide narrative, never expressing doubt or curiosity about alternative explanations, which could be interpreted as either loyalty to her dead husband's memory or knowledge of what really happened and determination to protect that secret. The truth is we'll never know with certainty what happened in that guest bedroom on February 16, 1929, because everyone with direct knowledge is long dead, because the evidence was deliberately destroyed in the investigation's aftermath, because the institutions that should have sought truth were corrupted by oil money and social pressure, and because the passage of nearly a century has transformed what might have been a solvable mystery into a historical enigma. But the lack of definitive answers is itself revealing, tells us something important about how power operates, about how wealth purchases not just luxury but impunity, not just mansions but the right to rewrite reality. What we do know is that the shooting destroyed whatever peace the Doheny family had tried to purchase with their limestone palace. Edward Sr., who had built Greystone to secure his dynasty's future, instead saw it become the site of his dynasty's destruction, his only son dead, his grandchildren traumatized, his family name attached not to oil-baron respectability but to scandal and mystery. Edward Sr. himself never lived at Greystone after the shooting, couldn't bear to enter the building where his son had died, and his remaining years, until his death in 1935, were marked by increasing isolation and bitterness, the kind of emotional deterioration that money cannot prevent and power cannot control. The mansion itself stood empty for long periods after the shooting, because Lucy couldn't live there and Edward Sr. wouldn't, and even after Edward Sr.'s death, when the property passed through various family members and was eventually sold, it carried the stigma of violence, the sense that something terrible had happened within its walls and that the magnificent architecture couldn't erase the bloodstains, literal and figurative. The city of Beverly Hills acquired Greystone in 1965 through a transaction so complex and so favorable to the city that it suggested the family was desperate to be rid of the property, and the city has operated it as a public park ever since, opening the grounds to visitors and the interior to film crews, because Greystone's combination of architectural grandeur and dark history makes it perfect for Hollywood, and the mansion has appeared in dozens of films and television shows, always playing the role of old money, of established power, of the kind of generational wealth that appears solid and permanent but harbors secrets. There is a deep, bitter irony in this. The building that Edward Doheny built to cement his family's respectability has instead become a stage set, a prop in other people's narratives, a visual shorthand for the corruption and violence that lurk beneath American aristocracy's polished surface, and every time a director uses Greystone to represent old money in a film, they are unconsciously telling the truth about what the mansion really represents, about the blood money that built it and the scandal that defined it. Modern visitors to Greystone, walking through the manicured gardens and peering through the mansion's windows, typically know nothing of the murder, because the official tour materials, carefully written to avoid litigation or controversy, describe the architecture and the family's oil wealth but gloss over the shooting with vague references to tragedy and mysterious circumstances, as if even now, nearly a century later, the full truth is still too disturbing, too complicated, too revealing of how power operates to be stated plainly. And this ongoing censorship, this determination to present a sanitized version of history, is itself a continuation of the cover-up that began in 1929, a reminder that some secrets are so valuable that institutions will protect them long after the principals are dead and the stakes have changed. But the archives tell a different story, because historians and journalists who have dug through the newspapers, the court records, the police files, what remains of them, and the private letters have assembled a picture of that February night that is far more complex and troubling than the official murder-suicide verdict. And their work reveals not just what might have happened but why it matters, why we should care about an unsolved murder from 1929, because this story is not just about two men dying in a mansion but about the machinery of power, about how wealth can purchase silence, about how institutions designed to reveal truth can be captured and corrupted, and about how the most elaborate and expensive architecture cannot protect us from the consequences of the lives we choose to live and the secrets we choose to keep. The Doheny family's story doesn't end with the murder, because wealth of that magnitude has momentum, continues to shape the world long after the individuals who created it are gone, and the fortune that Edward Sr. built on Mexican oil, on bribed politicians, on dead workers, and on his son's blood continued to grow through the 1930s and 1940s, was inherited by Ned's children, was invested in real estate and banking and entertainment, was diversified and legitimized through donations to universities and museums and hospitals, until the name Doheny appears today not on FBI files or congressional investigation reports but on campus buildings at USC, on wings of art museums, on charitable foundations that fund scholarships and medical research, and this transformation from blood money to philanthropic capital is perhaps the ultimate vindication of Edward Sr.'s strategy, the proof that sufficient time and careful management can indeed wash away any stain, can transform even the most tainted fortune into respectable old money. But Greystone remains, and its presence complicates this narrative of redemption, because while the money has been laundered through generations of investment and philanthropy, the building stands as physical evidence of what that money really represented, of the violence and exploitation that created it, and of the secrets that wealth both enables and demands, and every tourist who visits, every film crew that shoots there, every Beverly Hills resident who walks the grounds, is implicitly participating in the ongoing argument about what this mansion means, about whether it's a monument to American achievement or a crime scene that never received proper investigation, and the answer, like most answers to questions about class and power in America, is that it's both, simultaneously, and that this contradiction is not a bug but a feature of how wealth operates in American society. The Doheny murder mystery has spawned dozens of books, articles, documentaries, and amateur investigations over the decades, each proposing new theories, uncovering new evidence, or reinterpreting old facts, and this ongoing fascination suggests that the case resonates with something deeper than mere true crime curiosity, that there's something about this story, about vast wealth failing to protect the people it was supposed to serve, about forbidden love destroyed by social convention, about institutions corrupted by money, about a beautiful palace that became a prison, that speaks to fundamental anxieties about American capitalism and the costs of success. The question, what really happened at Greystone on February 16, 1929, is ultimately less important than the question, why were we never allowed to find out, because the answer to the second question reveals how power protects itself, how wealth purchases not just luxury but control over narrative, how institutions that claim to serve justice serve instead the interests of the powerful, and how this dynamic hasn't fundamentally changed in the century since Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett died in that guest bedroom, because we live now in an era when the wealthy still commit crimes with impunity, when police investigations still favor the powerful, when press coverage still defers to money, and when beautiful architecture still hides ugly truths. Greystone stands today as a monument to American contradictions, to the dream of unlimited wealth and the nightmare of what that wealth costs, to the promise of self-reinvention and the reality of inherited advantage, to the public performance of respectability and the private truth of scandal, to the aspiration of building something permanent and the inevitability of decay and revelation. And walking through its rooms, even now, even after all these years, you can feel the weight of the secrets those walls contain, can sense that something terrible happened here, something that all the limestone and oak paneling and crystal chandeliers cannot erase, because blood soaks into stone, metaphorically speaking, and no amount of time or money can wash it away. The final irony, perhaps, is that Edward Doheny's attempt to secure his legacy through architecture failed completely. Greystone did not establish the Doheny family as American aristocracy, did not erase the taint of his robber baron origins, did not protect his son from violence or his family from scandal, and today, when people remember the Doheny name, if they remember it at all, it's not because of the oil empire or the philanthropic donations but because of the murder, because of the scandal, because of Greystone itself standing as evidence that no palace, however magnificent, can protect us from ourselves, from our desires, from our secrets, from the consequences of building our dreams on other people's suffering. So what should we take away from this story, we who live in an era of wealth inequality that rivals the 1920s, we who watch billionaires build their own Greystones in Silicon Valley and Manhattan, we who are told that wealth is the ultimate measure of success and that accumulation is its own justification? Perhaps the lesson is that every fortune has a body count, literal or figurative, that every mansion is built on sacrifice, that every dynasty's foundation is soaked with blood and tears, not because rich people are uniquely evil but because the systems that enable wealth accumulation require exploitation, require violence, require the transformation of human beings into resources to be extracted and discarded, and no amount of philanthropy, no number of museum wings or scholarship funds, can change that fundamental math. Perhaps the lesson is that secrets are poison, that the closet kills, that the gap between public performance and private truth creates a psychological pressure that eventually explodes, and that the explosion harms not just the people keeping the secret but everyone around them, rippling outward in waves of pain and confusion and unanswered questions. Perhaps the lesson is that institutions cannot be trusted to investigate the powerful, that police serve property not people, that justice is and has always been a commodity available for purchase, and that if we want truth we cannot wait for official investigations but must dig ourselves, must question official narratives, must assume that the first explanation is always incomplete and usually deliberately misleading. Perhaps the lesson is simply that architecture cannot save us, that beautiful spaces cannot compensate for ugly lives, that you cannot buy your way out of moral accountability no matter how much limestone you pile up, and that in the end, the only legacy that matters is not the buildings we leave behind but the way we treated people, the lives we touched, the love we gave and received without shame or secrecy. Greystone endures, will likely endure for centuries more, preserved now not by private wealth but by public stewardship, transformed from private palace to public park, from symbol of dynasty to cautionary tale, and perhaps that transformation is itself a kind of justice, not the justice of solved mystery and punished crime, but the justice of truth gradually asserting itself, of secrets eventually leaking out, of beautiful lies giving way to ugly truths, and of a building that was meant to proclaim the Doheny family's triumph instead becoming a testament to their tragedy, a 55-room reminder that all the money in the world cannot protect you from the consequences of the life you choose to live, the love you choose to hide, and the truth you choose to deny, and that stone walls, however thick, however expensively constructed, cannot keep out the darkness when the darkness lives inside.